cases that won't stay quiet, crime stories that still spark the fiercest debates and polarise the world. Welcome to Controversial Crimes. I'm your host, Simone Bella. Join the discussion, share your thoughts in the search for the truth. Our journey begins now. At 2:31 a.m, a woman called 911 and said someone had stabbed her children. 30 years later, the question isn't who made the call, it's whether the story that followed ever deserved to become a death sentence. The case of Darlie Routier remains one of the most polarising capital murder cases in American history. Convicted in 1997 for the stabbing death of her 5-year-old son, Damon, and implicated in the death of her 6-year-old son, Devon, Routier has spent nearly 3 decades on Texas's death row. The narrative presents a stark dichotomy. To the state of Texas, she is a cold-blooded filicide who slaughtered her children to escape financial burden and maintain a materialistic lifestyle. To her defenders, including the Innocence Project, her family and friends, and her former husband, she is a wrongful conviction victim, a grieving mother railroaded by a misogynistic media climate and a rush to judgment by law enforcement. Today, public opinion is deadlocked between 2 entrenched camps: those who view the physical evidence as irrefutable proof of a mother's guilt, and a growing movement of advocates who believe she is an innocent woman vindicated by facts, yet stalled by the agonising delays of the appellate courts. To examine the competing claims beneath decades of speculation, we will dissect the case file from the ground up, covering the initial forensic timeline, the polarised trial testimony, and the sensationalist media coverage. This review traces the legal odyssey that coincided with and contributed to the push for expanded DNA mandates. This case file does not seek to retry Darlie Routier, but to examine why the evidence continues to divide experts, courts, and the public. Where interpretations differ, both are presented, but emphasis is placed on unresolved questions rather than settled conclusions. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania, but spent much of her upbringing in Lubbock, Texas, where she eventually met her future husband, Darren Routier. The couple were high school sweethearts, married, and eventually settled into the upscale community of Rowlett, Texas. Together they built a family business called Tesnac Electronics, a company that tested and repaired computer circuit boards. The business became highly successful, allowing the young couple to quickly ascend to a life of affluence. Darlie, 26, and Darren, 28, were living what appeared to be the American dream. However, beneath the surface, fractures were present. Their family business was faltering, debts were mounting, and Darlie was reportedly suffering from postpartum depression following the birth of her 3rd son, Drake, 7 months prior. The events of June 6, 1996, at 5801 Eagle Drive in Rowlett, Texas, form the crux of the mystery. The Routier home, a 2-story residence in a middle-class suburb, was quiet. On this night, Darlie slept downstairs in the family room with Devon, 6, and Damon, 5, to watch television, while Darren slept upstairs with the infant Drake. It is the last moment of peace this family will ever know. Within hours, this quiet living room will become a devastating crime scene, and the question that will haunt the world for the next 30 years is unresolved for some. Did an intruder flee into the night, or was the killer still in the house? What follows is a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the early morning hours of June 6, 1996. It is critical to note from the outset that there is no single, universally accepted timeline. Some elements are undisputed, others come only from Darlie Routier's account. and still others are reconstructions proposed by investigators and forensic analysts based on the physical evidence. According to Darlie Routier, she was awakened not by a noise, but by a physical sensation, her 5-year-old son, Damon, pressing down on her shoulder. In her disoriented state, she initially believed he was simply trying to wake her. Within seconds, she realised something was wrong. Investigators do not dispute that Darlie was asleep in the family room with the children. However, there is no independent evidence confirming what specifically woke her, making this moment dependent entirely on her testimony. Darlie states that she then saw a man standing near her feet, a white male wearing a dark t-shirt, jeans and a baseball cap. She claims that as she became fully alert, the man turned and fled from the living room towards the kitchen. Law enforcement later questioned whether an intruder was present at all, but no physical evidence definitively disproves that a person could have been in the room at this moment. This element remains one of the case's central disputes. According to Darlie, the intruder ran through the kitchen towards the utility room and escaped through the garage. She claims that during this flight, a large butcher knife was dropped on the kitchen floor. Darlie admits that as she followed the path briefly, saw the knife, picked it up, and placed it on the kitchen counter. This action, undisputed by Darlie herself, would later become a focal point for the prosecution. Investigators later challenged this sequence, arguing that the knife's location and blood patterns were inconsistent with a hurried intruder dropping it while fleeing. Darlie states that it was only after placing the knife on the counter that she fully comprehended the severity of her children's injuries. She began screaming for her husband, Darren, who was asleep upstairs with their infant son. At some point during this chaos, Darlie realised she herself had been wounded. Medical records later confirmed that she had sustained a deep slash to the neck and significant bruising. The existence of the injuries is undisputed. How and when they were inflicted remains contested. At approximately 2:30 a.m, Darlie placed a 911 call. What followed was a 6-minute and 44-second recording that would become the most heavily scrutinised piece of evidence in the case. The timing of the call, the voices captured, and the arrival of the first responders are undisputed. However, interpretations of Darlie's behaviour during the call, her emotional shifts, statements, and priorities are sharply divided and form the basis of opposing narratives presented at the trial. What is undisputed is that within a span of minutes, 2 children were mortally wounded, their mother was severely injured, and police were summoned to the home. What remains unresolved is the order, intent, and authorship of the violence itself. This compressed window, measured in minutes and seconds, became the battleground on which the entire case was built. Whether those minutes reflect the actions of a fleeing intruder or a staged sequence by a surviving parent depends not on a single fact, but on how each fragment of the timeline is interpreted.
911, what is your emergency? Ma'am? What? Who did? Hang on. Listen to me. I need you to... Oh my God! Can you take the radio clip? Yes. Ma'am, I need you to talk to me. Ma'am, I can't understand you. You're going to have to slow down, calm down, and talk to me. What is going on? Somebody's keeping them all sleeping. Me and my little boys are sleeping downstairs. Stand there, baby. Stand there. Look up. I was trying to ran out to the garage. They're not dead. My daughters are dying. They're dead. Oh, my God. Down the telephone. Oh, my God. Just that not one. Hold on, honey. Hold on. Oh, my God.
screams you just heard mark the beginning of 5 minutes and 44 seconds that would become one of the most polarizing recordings in Texas criminal history. Demeanor evidence is powerful precisely because it feels intuitive, even when it's unreliable. Listeners are often struck by Darlie's rapid shifts, from screaming terror to lucid descriptions. This on-off behaviour became a central pillar of the state's argument that the emotions were staged. But how you interpret these shifts depends entirely on your own bias. Let's look at the critical moments. First, the opening seconds. Darlie screams, "Someone came in." The prosecution argued this was Darlie setting the stage, establishing her narrative before even asking for help. But the defence argued this is primal instinct. She is identifying the threat first because she believes the killer is still close. Then the infamous comment about the knife. 30 seconds in, she worries about fingerprints. To the state, this was damning. Why would a grieving mother care about forensics? It sounded like a criminal covering her tracks. The defence countered with the cops effect, arguing that in 1996, police procedurals were popular. In a panic, her brain latched onto the irrational fear that she had ruined the evidence. Her interactions with her husband were also interpreted differently. When she instructed Darren to get towels, prosecutors viewed it as an effort to manage the scene, whereas the defence characterised it as an urgent attempt to stop the bleeding. And finally, the moment she declares them dead. Did she give up too early because she knew she had killed them? Or was she simply the only one in the room seeing the horrific reality of their injuries? A critical point made by the prosecution was that Darlie's screaming seemed to stop instantly when Officer Waddle entered the room, transitioning into a flat affect. The defence countered with expert testimony on dissociative shock, arguing that the brain often shuts down emotional processing when overwhelmed by trauma, resulting in a zombie-like state that can be mistaken for calmness. Law enforcement arrived at the scene within 3 minutes of the call. Officer David Waddle was the first at the scene. He initially came across Darren running across the front yard to secure medical assistance from a neighbour who was a nurse. The officer stopped him and they went back towards the house. Officer Waddle stepped through the front door, entering a scene of absolute carnage. He found Darlie screaming near the kitchen, clutching towels to her neck. Nearby, her husband Darren was kneeling over their son Damon, desperately attempting to perform CPR. Paramedics followed closely behind police. They determined that 6-year-old Devon was already deceased, having succumbed to fatal stab wounds to the chest. 5-year-old Damon, however, was still clinging to life. Paramedics rushed to stabilise him, finding a faint pulse, but the severity of his injuries was too great. He died in the ambulance before reaching the hospital. Darlie was treated for the slash across her throat, a wound that came within millimetres of her carotid artery, and was transported to Baylor University Medical Center for emergency surgery. As the ambulance sirens faded, the house fell silent, and detectives began the grim task of processing the scene. The physical evidence left behind was interpreted by investigators as inconsistent with the story of a fleeing intruder. Within hours, investigators began to reassess the intruder theory. Investigators immediately noticed a stark contrast between the injuries sustained by the mother and her children. Devon and Damon had been stabbed repeatedly with brutal, deep force that penetrated their chests and backs. injuries indicative of overkill and intense rage. Darlie, by contrast, had sustained a slash wound and bruising. Police questioned why a frenzied killer would massacre 2 children but leave the only adult witness alive with survivable injuries. The garage window screen had been cut, which Darlie identified as the intruder's escape route. However, police noted that the dust on the windowsill was undisturbed, and there were no footprints in the flower bed outside. Expensive jewelry, including Darlie's rings and watch, was sitting openly on the kitchen counter. The typical motive for a break-in was evidently absent. If this was a burglary gone wrong, the intruder had ignored thousands of dollars in easily accessible items. Darlie was found wearing only a nightshirt and no underwear. While this state of undress initially suggested a sexually motivated attack, medical examinations later confirmed that no sexual assault had occurred. This left investigators with a critical question. If the motive wasn't burglary, jewelry left behind, and wasn't sexual, what was the intruder's goal? A broken wine glass lay on the floor near the kitchen island. Darlie claimed she ran through this area to chase the intruder, yet investigators found no cut on her bare feet. The prosecution would later argue it was impossible to run through broken glass barefoot without injury. A vacuum cleaner was found sitting in the middle of the living room. Blood evidence indicated that the vacuum had been wheeled through a pool of wet blood, leaving wheel tracks, and was left standing. Investigators later testified, and prosecutors argued, that this sequence of events suggested Darlie was moving items around to stage a struggle after the attack, but before the knife was dropped. While the living room and kitchen were covered in blood, there was a conspicuous lack of blood leading out of the house. No bloody footprints trailed through the utility room or into the garage, raising the question, how did a violent attacker flee without leaving a trail? Perhaps most puzzling was the kitchen sink. Detectives found evidence that blood had been cleaned up and the counter had been wiped down. Within hours of the murders, the investigation had turned inward. The police weren't just looking for a man in a dark t-shirt anymore. They were looking at the mother who survived. In the days following the murders, Darlie and Darren Routier cooperated fully with the Rowlett Police Department. Despite her injuries and the immense trauma of losing 2 children, Darlie agreed to provide a video walkthrough of the crime scene. Heavily medicated and bandaged, she walked investigators through the events of the night, a piece of evidence that would later be used to highlight inconsistencies in her story. However, while the family grieved, investigators were quietly building a case that pointed not to an intruder, but to the mother herself. 8 days after the murder, on what would have been Devon's 7th birthday, the Routier family held a memorial service at the gravesite. Local news crews were invited to film the gathering. The footage captured Darlie smiling, chewing gum, and spraying silly string over her son's graves while singing Happy Birthday. To the public and law enforcement, the video was damning. It appeared to show a woman devoid of grief, celebrating in the wake of a massacre, while family members later explained that the party was held to honour Devon's memory in a way he would have loved, and that a 2-hour sombre, tearful vigil had taken place just moments before the cameras rolled. The damage was done. The silly string video turned the tide of public opinion and hardened the resolve of investigators. demeanour evidence is legally admissible but not scientifically reliable. Behind the scenes, prosecutors describe the forensic evidence as painting a grim picture. The state argued that the timeline and physical clues suggested the crime had been staged. FBI analysis concluded, based on a cut pattern and fibre interpretation, that the screen was likely cut from the inside with a bread knife from the Routier's own kitchen block. Analysis of Darlie's nightshirt revealed cast-off blood patterns on the back of the shoulder. Prosecution experts argued this could only happen if she was swinging the knife herself, raising the arm above her head. Luminol testing near the kitchen sink revealed significant amounts of blood that had been wiped away, supporting the theory that Darlie had attempted to clean herself up before staging the scene and calling 911. On June 18, 1996, just 12 days after the murder and 4 days after the release of the gravesite video, the investigation reached its conclusion. Darlie Routier was arrested at her home and charged with capital murder. The charge was specifically for the death of 5-year-old Damon, a strategic legal decision that would allow prosecutors to seek the death penalty. As she was led away in handcuffs, the question of why remained. The prosecution prepared to argue that a combination of financial ruin and postpartum depression had driven a suburban mother to do the unthinkable, while Darlie steadfastly maintained her innocence, insisting the real killer was still out there. The trial of Darlie Routier began on January 6, 1997, in the small conservative town of Kerrville, Texas. The location had been moved from Dallas County due to the overwhelming pretrial publicity, but the media frenzy followed the proceedings. The prosecution, led by Greg Davis and Toby Shook, made their intentions clear from the start. They were seeking the death penalty for the murder of 5-year-old Damon. Darlie was represented by Doug Mulder, a high-profile defense attorney known for his courtroom prowess. The state's strategy was aggressive and twofold. They aimed to prove the physical impossibility of an intruder's presence, while systematically dismantling Darlie's character to present her as a materialistic, self-centered woman capable of filicide. The prosecution's most damaging weapon against Darlie's character was a video recorded by the local news crew 8 days after the murder. The footage showed the Routier family gathering at the cemetery to celebrate what would have been Devon's 7th birthday. In the clip shown to the jury, Darlie appeared to be smiling, chewing gum, and spraying silly string over the grave markers while singing Happy Birthday. Prosecutors argued this behaviour was fundamentally inconsistent with a grieving mother. They portrayed it as evidence of a lack of remorse and a narcissistic need for attention, suggesting she was relieved to be free of her children. What the jury did not see was the 2-hour memorial service that preceded the birthday party. Witnesses later testified that the family had spent hours weeping and praying before deciding to honour Devon's memory with a birthday celebration as he would have wanted. The jury only saw the happy clips, devoid of the sombre context. The forensic cornerstone of the state's case came from expert witness Tom Bevel. He focused on the blood found on the back of the nightshirt Darlie was wearing during the attack. Bevel identified specific droplets of the boy's blood on the back of Darlie's shirt. He testified that these were cast-off stains, patterns created when blood flung from a weapon as it was raised backward for another strike. This testimony was presented as implicating Darlie as the person wielding the knife. The defence argued that these stains were misinterpreted. They suggested the blood could have been transferred during the chaos of Darlie tending to her dying children, performing CPR, or flailing her arms in defence during the attack. Since Darlie Routier's trial, blood pattern analysis has come under intense scrutiny. Multiple studies and court rulings have found BPA to be highly subjective dependent on analyst interpretation, and vulnerable to confirmation bias, particularly in staged scene cases. Prosecutors reinforced their theory with the physical oddities of the crime scene. They highlighted the lack of blood in the garage, the undisturbed dust on the windowsill, and the fact that the window screen had been cut from the inside using a knife from the Routier kitchen. They argued that the intruder was a fiction created by Darlie to cover her tracks. Let's pause here, because everything you've heard is only half the courtroom. For weeks, the jury was presented with a single coherent story, a staged crime scene, a calculated mother, and forensic evidence that appeared to point in only one direction. Piece by piece, the prosecution assembled a narrative designed to feel complete. But a criminal trial is not a documentary, it's an adversarial process. And for every fact that the state presented as settled, the defence would argue there was another explanation, one that police dismissed, evidence that was minimised, and questions that were never fully answered. What the jury heard next was not a counter-story, but a challenge to certainty itself. The defence argued that the police, blinded by the initial suspicion of Darlie, had rushed to judgment and ignored critical evidence pointing to an intruder. Doug Mulder's team focused on the physical evidence that contradicted the state's timeline. The defence argued that an unknown intruder entered the Routier home, attacked Darlie and her sons, and fled. They claimed this explanation fit both the physical evidence and Darlie's injuries, particularly the deep throat wound that narrowly missed the carotid artery. Medical testimony described the injury as severe, involving significant blood loss and extensive treatment, making self-infliction highly unlikely. The defence concluded it was implausible that Darlie would risk a potentially fatal injury to stage the crime. They further argued that her post-crime behaviour should be understood within the context of acute shock and psychological trauma, rather than interpreted as evidence of guilt. A crucial piece of evidence for the defence was a white tube sock belonging to Darren, found in an alleyway approximately 75 yards from the Routier home. DNA testing revealed the sock contained blood from both Devon and Damon. For Darlie to have planted this sock, she would have had to run 75 yards down the alley, barefoot, drop the sock and run back, all while bleeding from her own neck wound. Investigators found no blood trail leading to or from the alley, and Darlie's feet had no cuts or scrapes consistent with running on a rough pavement. Darlie's account of the attack included a detail about seeing an angel or spirit as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The prosecution dismissed this as a fabrication, but the defence portrayed it as a genuine trauma response. More critically, several neighbours reported seeing a mysterious dark sedan patrolling in the alleyway in the days leading up to the murders. Despite the reports, police never identified the driver, leading the defence to argue that investigators had tunnel vision. The state's primary motive was that Darlie killed her children to relieve the family's financial burden. The defence argued this was mathematically absurd. Darren Routier held an $800,000 life insurance policy. In stark contrast, the boys had only small policies worth $10,000, barely enough to cover funeral costs. If Darlie were the cold, calculating material girl the state portrayed, killing the children provided no financial gain. The defence argued that if she was truly killing for money, the logical target would have been her husband, not her sons. Most significantly, the defence argued that portraying Darlie as a bad mother was not supported by trial testimony. Most witnesses who knew Darlie described her as kind, attentive, and deeply involved in her children's lives, directly contradicting claims that she was selfish, detached, or negligent. The prosecution's narrative relied more on subjective judgments about demeanour and idealised expectations of motherhood than on evidence of abuse and neglect. Overall, the testimony depicted a loving, engaged parent, suggesting the bad mother label was driven by moral judgment rather than factual proof. Despite the defence's efforts to highlight reasonable doubt, the jury was swayed by the forensic testimony and the damaging character evidence.
She was innocent and not guilty. But Charlie says the jurors kept playing this tape and challenging his notion that an innocent woman could act this way.
She wasn't grieving, spraying the city string and gnawing on that chewing gum.
On February 1, 1997, after hours of deliberation, Darlie Routier was convicted of capital murder of Damon Routier. 3 days later, the same jury returned a sentence of death.
The guilty verdict. But even going off to death row, she protested her innocence.
I didn't murder my children.
While forensic evidence drove the state's case, its emotional force came from character assassination. The prosecution didn't just argue that Darlie Routier committed murder, they argued she was the kind of woman who would. They dismantled her image as a mother and replaced it with a caricature of a vain, materialistic woman who valued appearance and possessions over people. Prosecutors Toby Shook and Greg Davis portrayed Darlie as a debt-ridden, material girl, unwilling to abandon a lavish lifestyle. They repeatedly emphasised her appearance: bleached hair, jewellery and breast implants, framing vanity and sexual appeal as evidence of moral deficiency and maternal failure. The jury was also presented with a catalogue of luxuries: a Jaguar, a boat, a large home and expensive tastes. Against claims of financial distress, the state proposed a disturbing motive: that Darlie killed her children to remove a financial burden and preserve her lifestyle. Some witnesses described Darlie as self-centered and materialistic, more invested in appearances than her sons. Prosecutors put together gruesome crime scenes with images of her high life, deliberately provoking moral revulsion. This strategy exploited entrenched gender norms and class resentment in 1996 Texas. A good mother was expected to be modest, self-sacrificing and demure, standards Darlie visibly violated. By focusing on her perceived moral flaws, the prosecution bridged gaps in weak forensic evidence, persuading the jury that a bad woman could easily be an evil one. The trial became less about what happened in the living room and more about who Darlie was argued to be in the mirror. Crucially, Darlie's trial cannot be divorced from the cultural context of the mid-90s. Just 2 years prior, Susan Smith had drowned her 2 sons in South Carolina, initially sparking a nationwide manhunt by blaming an African-American carjacker. The nation was betrayed by her televised tears when she confessed 9 days later. When Darlie Routier appeared on TV, crying and claiming an intruder attacked her, the public and the media were primed to see deception. This Susan Smith effect likely biased the jury pool and the investigation from day one, creating a presumption of guilt for any mother who survived an attack that killed her children. The jury wasn't just trying Darlie Routier, they were punishing the betrayal they felt from Susan Smith. A pivotal element of the state's case for premeditation rested on a single piece of paper, a diary entry written by Darlie on May 3rd, 1996, just 1 month before the murders. In the entry, Darlie wrote, "I hope that one day you will forgive me for what I am about to do. My life has been such a hard fight for such a long time, and I just cannot find the strength to fight anymore." The prosecution argued that the phrase, "what I am about to do," signalled premeditation, claiming Darlie planned to kill her children to escape financial stress and the burdens of motherhood. They used the entry to suggest weeks of contemplation, countering any claim of an impulsive act. The defence countered that this interpretation distorted the words of a desperate woman. They argued the entry reflected suicidal ideation linked to severe postpartum depression, noting Darlie had given birth 7 months earlier. According to the defence, she felt overwhelmed by exhaustion, finances, and self-perceived failure, and the forgiveness she sought referred to suicide, not harming her children. Following her conviction in February 1997, Darlie Routier was transferred to the Mountain View Unit, now the Patrick O'Donnell Unit, in Gatesville, Texas, where she has remained in solitary confinement for nearly 3 decades. While the world outside moved on, technologies advanced, her surviving son grew up, and her marriage dissolved, Darlie's life became frozen in a 60-square-foot cell. However, the legal battle over her guilt has never ceased. In fact, it has only intensified, evolving into a complex war over DNA evidence, forensic advancements, and the definition of reasonable doubt. The isolation of death row took a profound toll on the Routier family. For years, Darren Routier stood by his wife, maintaining her innocence despite the intense public scrutiny that viewed him with suspicion. However, the strain of the conviction eventually broke the marriage. In June 2011, Darren filed for divorce, stating that while he still believed Darlie was innocent, they needed to move on for the sake of their surviving son Drake, and to allow Darlie to focus solely on her appeals. The divorce was finalised later that year. Darlie has spent more than half her life on death row and remains one of the few women in Texas awaiting execution. Her case has become a high-profile battle for innocence advocates, led by the Innocence Project. This legal battle is fought on 3 distinct fronts: the early direct appeals, all denied; the federal constitutional challenges, currently paused; and the ongoing forensic testing. In the years immediately following the trial, the defence launched multiple attempts to overturn the verdict based on procedural errors. All were ultimately unsuccessful. The defence argued that Darlie's right to a fair review was violated because the official court reporter, Sandra Halsey, produced a transcript riddled with thousands of errors, omissions, and gibberish. While the Texas Court of Appeals acknowledged the incompetence, Halsey lost her licence and was indicted for record tampering. They ruled in 2003 that a reconstructed record based on audio tapes was sufficient to affirm the conviction. Darlie sued the city of Rowlett for violating her Fourth Amendment rights after police hid a microphone in a funeral urn to record the family's private prayer service. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed the suit, ruling the family had no reasonable expectations of privacy in a public cemetery. On May 17, 2004, the US Supreme Court denied Darlie's petition for writ of certiorari, refusing to review the case and letting the Texas conviction stand. With state appeals exhausted, Darlie's team filed a federal writ of habeas corpus in the Western District of Texas in 2005. This document is currently the critical safety net keeping her case active. It alleges constitutional violations and procedural errors that were not resolved in state court. Routier sought modern DNA testing on key biological evidence not fully tested at trial, arguing newer methods could support an unknown intruder theory and undermine the state's staged scene theory. Items included the bloody sock, fingerprints, hairs, pubic and facial, and other blood-stained evidence. The petition's alleged trial counsel provided constitutionally deficient representation by failing to adequately investigate, test, or challenge forensics and physical evidence, depriving Routier of a fair trial under the Sixth Amendment. Claims include violations of the 14th Amendment based on a failure to disclose or properly test potentially exculpatory evidence, Brady issues, denial of meaningful access to physical evidence, and procedural or transcript errors that undermined trial fairness. Although not a standalone ground for relief, Routier asserts actual innocence, particularly in light of the potential new scientific evidence. As part of broader constitutional error claims affecting the verdict and sentence, the petitions also address ADPA-related barriers, including timeliness, exhaustion of state remedies, and procedural defaults, which affect whether federal courts can reach the merits of the constitutional claims. This federal petition is currently subject to a stay and ambience. Federal Judge Samuel Berry effectively pressed pause on these constitutional arguments to allow the state courts time to conclude the ongoing DNA testing. The forensic trajectory of the case shifted in 2008 when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted Darlie the right to retest specific evidence using technology unavailable in 1997. The court noted that if these tests confirmed a third party, it could readily have tipped the jury's verdict. Specifically, bloodstains on the sock found 75 yards from the home that had previously yielded inconclusive results. Testing stains on Darlie's shirt to identify any blood belonging to a non-family member, facial and pubic hairs found at the scene, and unidentified dried flakes found on the utility room door. The state court initially rejected requests to test the bloody palm print on the coffee table and the butcher knife, ruling the defence failed to meet the strict no-fault standard for why these weren't tested earlier. Moving to federal court, Judge Sam Sparks and later Judge Berry granted joint requests to expand testing beyond the 2008 limits. This authorised testing on bloody fingerprints previously excluded and utilised touch DNA technology on the murder weapon, a method impossible during the original trial. As of early 2026, the case remains in a holding pattern. While the courts await the finalisation of advanced DNA workflows, significant intermediate results have been returned. The unidentified bloody print on the coffee table, Exhibit 85J, remains the defence's strongest piece of physical evidence of an intruder. In 2020, the print was run through the FBI's national database, AFIS. It yielded no match. This definitely excludes Darlie, Darren, and the children. However, because the intruder's prints are not currently in the system, the identity remains unknown. The defence argues the presence of an unidentified bloody print at the murder scene is exculpatory regardless of a specific name. Despite rounds of testing ordered in 2008, 2014 and 2018, no result has yet overturned the conviction. As of late 2024, advanced testing on the nightshirt and sock is technically ongoing. The delays are attributed to the complexity of touch DNA, the degradation of 30-year-old samples, and strict chain of custody protocols required to consume the evidence. Prosecutors have publicly stated that previous tests on over 100 samples matched only Darlie and her sons. In late 2024, the state remarked that they do not believe the remaining testing is going to move the needle one way or the other. The intruder theory currently rests on the confirmed presence of a bloody fingerprint that does not belong to the Routier family. However, until a DNA hit identifies a specific suspect, the federal court keeps the constitutional appeals on hold, leaving Darlie Routier suspended between the finality of a death sentence and the slow grind of forensic science. For nearly 2 decades, the public narrative of the Darlie Routier case was monolithic. It was defined by a single looping clip of silly string and the prosecution's assertion that a materialistic mother had snapped. However, as the years passed, a slow but steady stream of books, documentaries, and investigative reports began to chip away at that certainty, transforming Darlie from a clear-cut villain into one of the most polarizing figures in the American justice system. Precious Angels, 1998, by Barbara Davis became the definitive account of the case for years. It portrayed Darlie as guilty, heavily influencing early public opinion. Notably, the author later recanted her belief in Darlie's guilt, donating proceeds to the Routier family, but the initial damage was done. The case was featured in Forensic Files in 1999. This episode focused heavily on the blood spatter analysis and the staging of the crime scene, presenting the forensic evidence as irrefutable proof of her guilt. As Darlie settled into life on death row, a new wave of international media began to examine her not just as a criminal, but as a human being living in isolation. In 2013, Werner Herzog's On Death Row was released. In this chilling episode, legendary filmmaker Werner Herzog interviewed Darlie through the glass. He focused less on the evidence and more on the emotional reality of her existence, casting a haunting light on her humanity.
90% of the population capable of doing something of that nature. Could be that they're living a certain lifestyle, and his role is to be the provider. Her role is to provide him the children, the family, and he's falling down on his end of it, so she's going to let God repossess the children. You know, that's I'm not going to put myself through this problem anymore. Okay, why should I spend my time and energy mothering these children? They're an encumbrance to me now.
Yeah.
I don't know. Wild guess.
In 2015, a book was released, Dateline Purgatory, by Kathy Cruz. This marked a significant turning point in the literature. Cruz engaged legal experts to systematically dismantle the transgressions of the trial, highlighting the controversies of the death penalty and potential for a wrongful conviction. Additionally, in 2015, Death Row Stories and Death Row's Women with Susanna Reid were released. This brought the case to a wider audience. British journalist Susan Reid's interview was particularly notable for showing Darlie as articulate and steadfast, contrasting sharply with the dazed and confused image from 1996. The most significant shift in public perception occurred in 2018 with the release of the ABC documentary series The Last Defence. Unlike previous programs, this series critically examined the tunnel vision of the Rowlett Police Department. It highlighted the context missing from the character evidence, specifically the prayer service that preceded the infamous Silly String video. The documentary sparked a massive resurgence of interest, introducing the case to a new generation. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether Darlie was condemned for definitive proof of her actions or simply for how she looked and grieved. For the first time in 20 years, the public conversation shifted from how could she do it to what if she didn't.
He wanted to be 7. I did the only thing I knew to do to honor him and give him those wishes because he wasn't here anymore. But how do you know what you're going to do when you lose 2 children? How do you know how you're going to act? And who's to say there's a rule book to grieving? Who's to say if you don't follow these guidelines, that makes you a bad parent or that makes you a murderer?
It is important to note, however, that this shift in public perception has not produced professional consensus. A number of forensic analysts, prosecutors and trial experts continue to stand by their original conviction, maintaining that the physical evidence, particularly the bloodstain pattern analysis and the absence of an exit blood trail and the perceived staging of the crime scene, remains more consistent with an inside offender than an unknown intruder. In other words, modern skepticism has fractured certainty, but it has not replaced it with agreement. The case of Darlie Routier is a tragedy compounded by ambiguity. For the state of Texas, the file was closed on February 4, 1997. To them, the physical evidence, the screen, the sink, and the blood spoke louder than a mother's screams. They contend that the justice system worked exactly as intended, removing a dangerous woman from society. However, for Darlie Routier and her supporters, the file remains agonisingly open. They argue that a rush to judgment fueled by a media spectacle and a misunderstanding of forensic science may have condemned a woman who has maintained her innocence for decades on death row. They point to the invisible evidence, the bloody fingerprint, the sock in the alley, and the unidentified DNA, as proof that a possible assailant may have faded into the night, leaving Darlie to take the blame. Cases like Darlie Routier's do not merely test the guilt or innocence of one individual. They test the limits of the justice system itself. They force us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that verdicts are rendered not in perfect conditions, but in moments shaped by the science of their time, the narratives that dominate public consciousness, and the human instincts of jurors asked to choose certainty over doubt. When circumstantial evidence, forensic interpretation, and character judgment align, they can produce a conclusion that feels unassailable, yet still leave room for error that cannot be undone. In a system where finality carries the weight of life and death, the cost of being wrong is absolute. As of the recent findings, the Darlie Routier case sits on a knife's edge, suspended between the finality of a death sentence and the potential breakthrough of modern science. Until the final DNA results are returned, the house on Eagle Drive remains a symbol of American justice's most terrifying question. Can someone be legally convicted, yet be factually innocent? Thanks for watching Controversial Crimes. If this case made you think, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future updates. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. As soon as there are new developments in the Darlie Routier case, I'll bring them to you in a follow-up video.